Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Break a Rule on Purpose 2021 contest results. Let's get right to these, and let's start off here with Frank Wuter's photo of the train. Okay, so I did have a couple of this was indicative of something that happened throughout, which was that I had trouble figuring out what the rule was that was broken. So I'm trying to figure out if it's a compositional rule or a few of you kind of played lawyer photographer and were like, well, I went out during lockdown. That was a rule. Okay, that's on me. So for not having the perfect category description. Anyway, so let's talk about this photo, which is, I think, a really nice photo. I really like the way that it's a very high contrast photo, right? You've got very deep darks and relatively light whites, but none of the whites are so blown out that they are completely devoid of detail. And so what that does is it puts an emphasis on the darkness of the overall subject, but more so on the darkness of the locomotive here. And I'd say the absence of information in the locomotive and the information that is there, which just kind of shows the details of certain parts of the locomotive structure, really make it a very visually interesting part of the photo. And so I really liked this image a whole lot because of how well the light in the image emphasizes just enough of the locomotive to let you get a good image in your mind of what it actually looks like. So I really did enjoy that image a lot. Very, very good image. All right, so this next photo comes to us from Tim Peters, and the rule that was broken was that it was during lockdown. So I really enjoyed the way that this image used light, because all of the lighting, not all of it, the important lighting is in scene. You can see there's the building behind this entryway, so there's clearly some out-of-frame lighting. However, the lighting in the awning of this entryway is providing the light that creates the majority of the image information, right? So mostly what this means is that everything that's involved in the universe of this image exists because of those 3 lights, or 6 if there's 3 more inside. It's kind of hard to tell if those are reflections or if they're actual lights. So at any rate, I do really like the way that the light is used in this image, and I think that using in-scene lighting to create the universe of the photo is a really good way to use in-scene lighting, and a very, very good instinct as a photographer. This photo was submitted by Kevin Rios, and it shows, man, there's a lot going on with angles in this photo. So the rule that I think was being broken here has to do with, is a compositional rule. So it doesn't follow the rule of thirds or halves or any, and the converging lines are kind of all over the place. So what it does, it also doesn't follow the rule of converging lines. And I think something about this photo just kind of works for it, right? Now, if you didn't have the plane in the sky, I don't think it would be as strong an image, because what the plane does as an element is it creates this strongly diagonal line that points, because the contrail is dissipating towards the center of the image. It points to the center of the image, which is kind of where the power lines are going. And also, you've got the windmill over there, and windmills really are just vertical lines, or horizontal-ish or angular if you look at them from the front. And then you've got the angles of these hills and their lines. You know, there's 2 hills, and so you have anyway, the whole image. Oh, and then of course you have the vertical lines of the power lines. The entire image comes down to the way that lines are used to create structure. And if you were to break this image down into just a series of lines and then fill in the spaces of those lines with different colors, blue or tan or white or black, now what you've got is this image again. It's a study of lines and the way that they are moving in all kinds of different directions. So I really enjoyed looking at this image as 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 it looks at how lines can, or in this case, cannot work together, but still deliver an interesting image. This photo comes from Richard Mander, and this was another one that I had a little bit of trouble figuring out what the rule that was being broken. So I did find it to be a pleasing image, right? You have a lot of good detail over on the right side of it, and then a big shadowy void over on the left side, and then a person for scale. So using the person for scale, of course, is a really good instinct because it shows the person who's looking at the photo how big the scene actually is. Without that person, it would be, you could kind of tell, but is that a walkway that two people could walk on, which it is, we can tell now, or is that a walkway that's, barely wider than a person's shoe? We wouldn't be able to tell without that person. So really, really good instinct there. I do also happen to like the way that the colors in this are used because they're a little muted, right? They're not super bright and saturated like a lot of people who shoot landscapes, myself included, tend to do. And I think that using more muted colors is a good instinct for this scene, and I guess in general, as a general statement, that would hold true for landscapes. So here's a photo that Rod Stewart sent in, and honestly, when I saw this one, I thought it was his multiple exposure photo, right? And so I went back and I looked at the email he sent and was like, am I getting this wrong somehow? Like, what did I, And so one of the things I struggled with this one again, and common statement here, and also the reason that this category will never appear again if I do this contest again, is that I couldn't figure out what rule was being broken here. I do really like the image structure. I really like it as a multiple exposure image, and I think that as an image that has, and this is something we've seen with all of Rod's photos this contest, is that there is a thought behind it that goes into the structure of it, and that the structure then conveys that thought. So all of the images that Rod sent are ones that require forethought and planning to convey a message. And that's something that's really hard to do and requires a lot of work and is excellent across the board. So also happen to enjoy this photo quite a bit. Here's a shot from Stephen Boyce. And, this was another one that I struggled with on which rule is being broken here, because this is a portrait that is straight out of classic and traditional portrait techniques from the early days of photography. You've got someone who's standing there. This could be a 1/250th of a second exposure, or it could be a 4-second exposure where the person just did a really good job of staying still. It could be taken with a digital camera, or it could have been taken on a glass plate. It's kind of impossible to tell just by looking at this. I would suggest this is probably a 35mm film photo, looking at the image characteristics. All that aside, the only rule that I see being broken here is the way that the background goes right through the subject's head. What's going really, really right. That doesn't, for this image, by the way, that doesn't bother me so much because the subject and the way he's dressed really makes it feel like this is an image that pays honor to vintage portrait photography. So I think that's just fine for this one. Anyway, really good use of having your image media and your image structure mirror the way that your subject is dressed for this photo. So good work on that. Here's one that comes from Aravindan, and his note said that said which rule was broken, and I thought he said it was blur, so I'm wondering if maybe I got this one. I'm not quite sure if I got this correct, but honestly, there's a lot going right with this image. Now, the only thing I did not care for about this image was the seagull wing right in front of it, right? Because it becomes sort of a distracting element. But if you look at the rest of the scene, you've got the person in the background and the bird over them. Those are really, and then it's just black and red. Like, this isn't a color palette that's used all that often. Even in red scale photography, this is not a color palette that shows up very, very often. And so it stands out because of the boldness of the colors. And I couldn't tell you if this was done with red scale film or done in post. My best guess is that this is a digital image that was manipulated in post to add the red cast. Although looking at some elements of the image, I could easily be wrong about that. Anyway, one of the things that I really like is how strongly horizontal this image is. All of the lines are basically horizontal, and you've got a very strong horizon line with clouds in the top that are very noticeable. You've got different gradations and different of red within them. And then one thing that is done really right here, by the way, is that bird's wing separates two areas in the foreground of light and dark. And I don't know why those two areas are so differently toned. Overall, it's such a bold image. It does really stand out, and it is really good. Yeah, I'd be pleased with this. So this one is from Diego Leone, and thank you, Diego, for pointing out that what you're doing here is breaking the Dutch angle rule, which I think is more of a cinematography rule than still imagery, or at best what I can say is it's not one in which I am super well versed. So I would have picked up that the horizons weren't level, but I wouldn't have figured out which specific rule you were going for here. So good use of, maybe it's the Dutch angle is this type of angle. Anyway, I really did like the way that the angles in this, the way that the camera's tilted, creates the angles that show the viewer what they should be looking at. Because what we should be looking at is that person on the stairs, right? And their relative aloneness in the rest of this scene. And the way that the angle of the building, so we've got the verticals, which are now pointing down left, and then the horizontal, which is now pointing down right, and then the bridge or the whatever has that railing on it that we're looking at, which now points up left. All of those create a wedge that in the dark tone on the right side just tends to compel the viewer's eyes towards the left. So we hit the buildings, our eyes aren't going off the frame because the buildings are there. They follow the lines down, they get to the dark tone, which pushes us to the left where we run into that railing, and we follow that left to the person who is now also hemmed in by the shadow of the lamppost. And so all of those image elements, whether they were consciously done this way or unconsciously and just an instinctual thing, combined to direct the viewer's eyes to the person. Now, if you go away from the person, now you've got that dark object behind them, which kind of brings your eyes back. So even though everything in this feels like it's going in a different direction, all the lines feel like they're going in a different direction, they are really all working together to bring your eyes to the subject of the photo. Very well done. For your honorable mentions, we have two. The first one comes from Chris May, and this is a photo of a heron. You know, I am pretty sure I have been there because that looks really familiar. Anyway, this was the rule that's being broken here is foreground, right? There's foreground blur that is sort of starting to block the subject. The rest of the image is classically composed. And I think that use of breaking the rule really works because the foreground blur isn't really obscuring the heron. And what it's done is it's taken an image that is, it's a heron standing on a fence post with prairie grasses behind it, right? And it's turned it into a color field. So instead of a bird on a fence with grasses, it's now a bird on, it's a fence, but you don't really see it as much in this field of bright yellow color. And so that yellow contrasts to the blues and the grays and whites and blacks of the bird. And it really, because the bird doesn't have any color on it, it really makes the rest of the colors in the scene pop. And so not only is it a good use of having foreground blur, it's also a good use of structuring along the rule of thirds, which this really adheres to very well, and also of having the bird looking across the frame instead of at the edge. And it's also a really good example of wildlife photography in general. So everything in here, including the rule breaking, really combines to make this a solid and pleasing photo. All Our next honorable mention comes from Danny Fluelling. And this was one that I struggled with a little bit, trying to figure out what the rule that was being broken was. But ultimately I put it in as an honorable mention because I really enjoyed the way that the image structure juxtaposes what's sharp and in focus versus what is blurred, intentionally I have to imagine, with motion. So I also really like the way that light was used, light again, and this is something I think we see in at least one or two other of Danny's submissions this year, is that the light is entirely within the frame. And so when you have the lighting inside of the frame, what happens is that you create this world or this universe for the image that originates within the frame and exists solely within the frame. And so we'll see throughout this contest, of course, is that there are a lot of photos where things that are outside of the frame exist in it. And then there are things that are only inside of the frame that exist in it. And in this, because of the way that light and sharp detail and motion blur and darkness were all used together, made this just a really captivating image that I really enjoyed and thought was a great execution of this prompt. Now, our runner-up, who's going to take home a roll of Fuji 120 film, is Samuel West, who I think this is, okay, so struggled with this one a little bit because the rule is apparently no swimming in this pond. But it also does break a couple of other rules about the way that the camera is held with angles, because as you can see that there, even though, well, the guy is a little bit of an angle, so the camera is held at a bit of an angle. And one of the reasons that I really liked this photo is because that person is held at an angle. And so when you take an image and you put it at a slight angle like this intentionally, it makes everything feel askew. And if you've ever seen a movie where the main character takes a punch or is dizzy or disoriented, the camera in the movie will generally not be perfectly vertical or horizontal. It will move, it will tilt, things like that. And so when you have a still image where things are tilted, it can, like this one does, give a sense that things are a little bit off. Beyond that, I think the overall structure of the image is brilliant. So you've got the 3 people watching, or 4 people, however many it is at the bottom of the photo, and then you've got this guy wading into the pond. And you've got some detail in his back and his underwear, or it looks like his underwear. But then really interestingly, you have the concentric circles of ripples moving away from him in circles. And then this roughly circular shape of 4 ducks. So it's like everything is now hemmed in into the frame by these circles. And so now you have circles inside of a square frame, and everything's just kind of working together really well. So in addition to everything about it being slightly askew, the use of shape in this image is really spectacular. Which brings us to the winner of the category, which was submitted by Noelle Verde. And this one really, from the moment I saw it, really stuck out in my mind. So compositionally, there are a few rules being broken here, right? A little bit off horizontal. The lamppost on the left is a little bit cut off. There's a little bit of space between the sign on the right, the edge of the frame, little things like that. The dog's not sitting at a rule of thirds junction. The dog is looking right at the edge of the frame instead of across it. And one of the things I really liked about this was the bold use of color. And we talked about earlier with Aravindan's photo, is red is a really eye-catching color, right? It really is bold. And if you see a photo that is mostly red, it's going to demand your attention. And so that's what this photo does. I also really like that what looks like a darker red paint that was used to cover up some graffiti, it's this abstract shape. Like over on the left, it looks like 2 people talking. And then on the right, it looks like a person holding a turtle. And then on the bottom right, it looks like a speech bubble. Maybe this whole thing is just what the dog is imagining. I don't know. I looked at this photo for quite a long time and found it to be very interesting and a good use of this prompt.